Before we begin today's tale, tell us, which city or country are you joining us from? We love connecting with our global audience. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. Shattered Homecoming. Marine Sergeant James Morrison gripped his military-issued duffel bag, his knuckles white against the worn canvas. The familiar weight of his combat uniform felt foreign now as he stood motionless on his driveway. 18 months of deployment, 3 months of being listed as missing in action, and countless battles had changed him. But nothing had prepared him for this moment. His son Tommy's innocent words pierced through his combat-hardened exterior like shrapnel. "Daddy's alive?" But Mommy and Uncle Steve already spent his death benefits. The 5-year-old's declaration hung in the air, each word a fresh wound. James had survived an ambush in the treacherous valleys of Afghanistan, watched his brothers in arms fall, and spent weeks evading enemy forces. He'd crawled through hell itself to make it back to base, driven by thoughts of his family. Now, standing before his own home, he realized he'd returned to a different kind of war zone. "Tommy, baby, come inside right now." Bethany's voice cracked with panic as she appeared at the doorway. Her face drained of color when she saw James. The designer handbag she clutched, one he'd never seen before, slipped from her grasp. "Hello, Beth," James said, his voice carrying the weight of mountains he'd crossed to get here. "Surprised to see your dead husband?" Steve emerged behind her, his muscular frame filling the doorway. The same frame that had once spotted James during their high school football practice, the same hands that had helped carry James's gear during basic training, now possessively gripped Bethany's shoulder. "James, buddy, we can explain," Steve started. But James cut him off with a razor-sharp laugh. "Explain what, Steve? How you helped my wife cash in on my death while I was fighting to stay alive. How you moved into my house. How you're playing daddy to my son." Neighbors began emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly widow from next door who'd sent James care packages throughout his deployment, pressed her hand to her mouth in shock. The Wilsons across the street stood frozen on their porch, their teenage daughters recording everything on their phones. "I attended your funeral," Mrs. Henderson whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We all did. 3 months ago, right here in town." James's jaw tightened. "A funeral? You organized a funeral for me?" His eyes locked onto Bethany, who shrank back against Steve. "They told us you were dead," Bethany stammered. "There was an explosion. There was an ambush," James corrected her, his voice deadly calm. "Martinez and Rodriguez died protecting our unit. I got separated during the firefight. But you didn't wait for confirmation, did you? Couldn't wait to declare me dead and move on." Tommy wiggled free from Bethany's grasp and ran toward James. Steve moved to stop him, but James's warning glare froze him in place. The boy crashed into his father's legs, wrapping his arms around them. "Daddy, look what I drew." Tommy pulled a crumpled paper from his pocket. "It's you as an angel in heaven." James knelt down, coming face to face with his son. The drawing showed a stick figure in uniform, complete with crude wings and a halo. In the background, 3 smaller figures held hands, labeled Mommy, Tommy, and Daddy Steve. "It's beautiful, buddy," James managed, his throat tight. He looked up at Steve, who had the decency to look away. "When did you start calling him Daddy Steve?" "After the funeral," Tommy replied innocently. "Mommy said you were in heaven watching over us, and Uncle Steve would take care of us now. We went to Disney World." James stood slowly, his son's drawing crumpled in his fist. "Disney World? That must have been expensive." "James, please." Bethany stepped forward, her designer shoes clicking against the driveway. "We thought you were dead." The military confirmed it. "We were grieving." "Grieving?" James's laugh was harsh enough to make several neighbors flinch. "Is that what you call spending my death benefits on luxury vacations? Nice shoes, by the way. Italian leather?" Steve moved between them, hands raised in a placating gesture. "Brother, let's talk about this inside." "Brother?" James's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You were my brother, my best friend since high school. I trusted you to look after my family if anything happened to me. Instead, you waited for the first opportunity to take everything I had." More neighbors had gathered, forming a loose circle around the unfolding drama. James recognized faces from backyard barbecues and community events, people who had celebrated holidays with him, who had supported his family during deployments. Now they watched in horrified fascination as his world crumbled. "Did you know?" James addressed the crowd, his voice carrying across the manicured lawns. "Did you all watch my so-called best friend move in on my wife while I was fighting for my life?" Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her aged face lined with grief and guilt. "They were careful at first," she said softly, "meeting when they thought no one was watching. But we saw. God help us, we saw." "Ellen, don't," Bethany pleaded. But Mrs. Henderson continued. "They started being more open about it after the military declared you missing in action. Steve resigned from his position and took a job at the insurance company. He helped Bethany with the paperwork to have you declared dead rather than missing." James turned back to Steve, his eyes cold. "An insurance company? Let me guess. The same one that paid out my death benefits?" Steve's silence was answer enough. Tommy tugged at James's uniform. "Daddy, are you mad at Mommy and Daddy Steve?" The innocent question cut through the tension like a knife. James looked down at his son, seeing confusion and fear in those familiar eyes, Bethany's eyes. "No, buddy," James said softly. "Daddy's just surprised. Why don't you go inside and play for a bit? The grown-ups need to talk. Promise you won't go back to heaven?" James felt his resolve crack slightly. "I promise, son. I'm not going anywhere." Mrs. Wilson stepped forward, offering to take Tommy inside her house. James nodded gratefully, watching as his son skipped away, oblivious to the storm brewing. Once Tommy was out of earshot, James turned back to Bethany and Steve. "How much was I worth to you? How much did you collect for my convenient death?" "400,000, Steve admitted, his professional mask slipping. "The policy paid out quickly because of my connections." "Your connections," James repeated. "So you didn't just help her spend my death benefits. You helped expedite my death certificate. Tell me, Steve, did you already have your eye on my wife when you took that insurance job?" "It wasn't like that," Bethany protested. "We were both grieving." "Stop saying that," James roared, causing several neighbors to step back. "You weren't grieving. You were profiting. How long, Beth? How long were you two planning this?" The silence that followed was deafening. Steve's hand found Bethany's, and James watched as years of friendship and trust crumbled in that simple gesture. "Get out of my house," James said quietly. "This isn't your house anymore," Steve replied, finding his courage. "Legally, everything transferred to Bethany when you were declared dead. We've already consulted lawyers." "Of course you have." James stepped closer, his combat training evident in his fluid movement. "You planned everything perfectly, didn't you? The quick death certificate, the insurance payout, the legal transfer of assets. Tell me, did you help her pick out her funeral outfit too?" "James, please," Bethany begged. "Think about Tommy. He's been through so much already. Because of you." James's voice cracked like a whip. "You let our son believe his father was dead. You let him draw pictures of me in heaven while you paraded around with my best friend. You used my death benefits to take him to Disney World." The gathered neighbors murmured, many turning away in shame. Mrs. Henderson approached James, her arthritic hand touching his arm gently. "You can stay with me, James," she offered. "My guest room is always ready for you. It has been since the funeral. I never believed you were gone." James nodded, his throat tight with emotion he refused to show. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I'll get my lawyers to contact you both," he addressed Bethany and Steve. "Every penny of that death benefit will be repaid. And Beth, I'm coming for custody of my son." "You can't," Bethany started, but James cut her off. "I can, and I will. You declared me dead for money. You let our son believe I was dead for money. Now you'll learn what it really costs to betray a Marine." James turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing, Steve. Remember that motto we had in high school? Brothers for life?" Steve nodded stiffly. "You died in Afghanistan with me. The Steve Russell I knew would never betray his brother like this. Remember that when you're lying in my bed tonight." As James walked away, followed by Mrs. Henderson, he heard Bethany collapse into sobs behind him. The neighbors dispersed quickly, leaving the couple alone in their ill-gotten gains. In Mrs. Henderson's guest room that night, James sat on the edge of the bed, surrounded by the same floral wallpaper he remembered from childhood visits. The old woman had always been like a grandmother to him, sneaking him cookies and telling him stories about his father, who'd served in Vietnam. They planned it all, Mrs. Henderson said softly, setting a cup of coffee on the nightstand. I watched them, James. I saw Steve visiting more and more frequently during your deployment. I saw them meeting in the park, at cafes, always with excuses about helping Bethany with paperwork or checking on Tommy. Why didn't anyone say anything? Who would we tell? Bethany controlled all your communications during deployment. And once you were declared missing, she trailed off. They moved fast after that. Steve already knew which forms to file, which officials to contact. It was like watching a play where everyone knew their parts except you. James stared into his coffee, seeing his reflection in the dark liquid. I survived that ambush thinking about them, about coming home. Rodriguez died covering me so I could make it to safety. Martinez took a bullet pushing me out of the kill zone. My brothers died helping me get back to my family, and all the while, my family was betraying me. Mrs. Henderson sat beside him, her weathered hand covering his. Then live for them, James. Live for Rodriguez and Martinez. Live for Tommy. But most importantly, live for justice. James looked at his elderly neighbor, seeing the steel beneath her grandmotherly exterior. Justice? I've lived long enough to know that karma doesn't always work on its own schedule, she said firmly. Sometimes it needs a helping hand. Those two played a long game to take everything from you. Maybe it's time to play your own game. For the first time since returning home, James felt a spark of something beyond anger. A purpose. A mission. They tried to erase me, he said quietly. Declared me dead. Spent my death benefits. Turned my son against me. They thought they could just write me out of my own life. So write yourself back in, Mrs. Henderson replied. But this time, make sure the ending serves justice. James nodded slowly, his military training already kicking in, analyzing angles, identifying objectives, forming strategies. Bethany and Steve had orchestrated his death for profit. Now he would orchestrate their downfall for justice. First, he said, standing up, I need to make some calls. Do you still have that old phone book? Mrs. Henderson smiled. Better. I have friends at the VFW who know excellent lawyers. Military lawyers who don't take kindly to people profiting from a soldier's supposed death. James looked at his elderly neighbor with new respect. She hadn't just offered him a room. She'd offered him a base of operations. Get some rest, she patted his hand. Tomorrow, we start planning your resurrection. And James? Welcome home, soldier. As Mrs. Henderson left the room, James pulled out his son's crumpled drawing. The stick figure angel in uniform stared back at him, a cruel reminder of how thoroughly he'd been betrayed. But angels were messengers of God, and some messages came with a reckoning. He would show them what it truly meant to have a ghost return from the dead. Chapter 2. The Bitter Truth. The Veterans Affairs office buzzed with fluorescent lit efficiency, but Rebecca Andrews felt anything but efficient as she reviewed the file before her. As a JAG officer, she'd seen her share of military benefit fraud cases, but this one made her blood boil. They didn't even wait for a body, she muttered, flipping through the expedited death certificate application. Her brother Michael had died in the same region where James Morrison had supposedly been killed. She knew the protocol, knew how long identification usually took. They had help, James replied, sitting ramrod straight in the plastic chair across from her desk. His uniform was immaculate, a stark contrast to the turmoil in his eyes. My friend Steve, he caught himself. Stephen Russell worked at Global Life Insurance. He knew exactly which strings to pull. Rebecca pulled up another document on her computer. Your wife Bethany filed for the death certificate just 2 weeks after you were declared missing in action. The standard waiting period is 1 year, unless there's irrefutable evidence of death. What evidence did they present? Satellite imagery of an explosion in your last known location, testimony from a local contractor about seeing American casualties, and... She paused, her face darkening. A sworn statement from your wife that she'd received personal effects confirmed to be yours. James leaned forward. What personal effects? Your grandfather's watch. The one you always wore on missions. The muscle in James's jaw ticked. I lost that watch during the ambush. It must have fallen off while we were taking fire. But how did they get it? Rebecca typed rapidly, pulling up more documents. According to the paperwork, it was recovered by a private military contractor and returned through official channels. The contractor's name is interesting. She turned the screen toward James. The contractor was listed as S. Russell Private Security. Son of a bitch, James breathed. Steve has a cousin who works private security in Afghanistan. They must have found my watch and… He trailed off, the implications hitting him. They used your lost watch to declare you dead, Rebecca finished. The insurance company fast-tracked the claim based on the death certificate and the physical evidence. $400,000 paid out within a month of your disappearance. James stood abruptly, pacing the small office. I was still out there, still fighting to survive. Rodriguez and Martinez died getting me to safety, and these people, my wife, my best friend, they were already dividing up my life like vultures. Rebecca watched him move, recognizing the contained fury in his movements. She'd seen it in her brother before his last deployment, that coiled energy of a warrior preparing for battle. There's more, she said softly. I had my contacts pull their financial records. They started spending immediately. $20,000 on a new car, $15,000 on home renovations, $30,000 on vacations. While I was eating rats and hiding in caves, James's laugh was bitter. What else? Rebecca hesitated, then pulled out another file. They've been busy socially too. Your neighbor Mrs. Henderson has been documenting everything. Apparently, she never bought their grief act. James took the file, leafing through pages of handwritten notes. Mrs. Henderson had recorded dates, times, locations, every interaction between Bethany and Steve going back months before James's deployment. Coffee meetings at Riverside Park, James read. Shopping trips to help with Tommy. Late-night visits to check on the house. That manipulative bastard was grooming my family before I even left. There's security camera footage too, Rebecca added. Mrs. Henderson's son works for the mall where Bethany and Steve like to shop. He kept copies of everything. The footage played silently on Rebecca's computer screen. Bethany and Steve walking hand in hand through the mall. Steve carrying Tommy on his shoulders. The three of them having lunch, laughing, looking like a perfect family. The timestamps, James noticed. These are from before I was declared missing. Rebecca nodded grimly. They weren't just opportunistic, James. This was premeditated. They planned your death even before you went missing. James stared at the footage, his hands gripping the edge of Rebecca's desk. How deep does this go? Your wife had a friend in military administration. Rebecca pulled up another document. Sarah Collins. She expedited the death certificate process, bypassed standard protocols. I've already flagged it for investigation. Sarah. James's voice was ice. She was at my wedding. Bethany's college roommate. She's agreed to cooperate in exchange for leniency. According to her statement, Bethany approached her about expediting death certificates 3 months before your deployment. She framed it as being prepared for the worst. James pushed away from the desk, his massive frame casting a shadow over Rebecca's office. Being prepared. They were preparing to erase me, to replace me. There's something else you need to see, Rebecca said, pulling a thick manila envelope from her drawer. Mrs. Henderson found these in your garage. Tommy's drawings. The envelope contained dozens of crayon drawings. James spread them across Rebecca's desk, each one a knife to his heart. The progression was clear, from pictures of Daddy fighting bad guys, to Daddy in Heaven, to My New Family, featuring Steve prominently. They coached him. James's voice was barely controlled. They coached my son to accept Steve as his father before I was even declared dead. Rebecca stood, moving around her desk. James, what they did, it's not just fraud. It's conspiracy. They manipulated the military death notification system, committed insurance fraud, and potentially interfered with military operations by declaring you dead while you were still in the field. They tried to kill me on paper because they thought I was already dead in reality, James said, gathering Tommy's drawings carefully. They built their new life on the assumption I'd never come back to expose their lies. But you did come back, Rebecca reminded him. And now we have evidence of their conspiracy. Multiple federal crimes. We can. No, James cut her off. Not yet. I need to understand everything first. Need to know how deep this betrayal goes. Who else was involved? Tommy's future depends on how we handle this. Rebecca studied him, recognizing the tactical mind at work. What's your plan? First, I need a place to stay. Mrs. Henderson's kind, but I need somewhere more permanent. Then I need access to Tommy, supervised visitation at minimum. Can you help with that? I can file emergency motions, Rebecca nodded. Your military status and the circumstances of their fraud should help. But James, they'll fight back. They have resources now. Your death benefits, Steve's insurance connections. James smiled, but it held no warmth. Let them fight. Let them spend every penny of my death benefits trying to keep what they stole. It'll make the evidence trail that much clearer. The veteran shelter on Pine Street has private rooms, Rebecca offered, run by ex-military. They'll understand your situation, give you space to plan. Perfect. Close enough to monitor them, far enough to think clearly. James gathered the evidence files. Rebecca, thank you. Not many lawyers would take this case. My brother died in those mountains. Rebecca's voice caught slightly. The same region where you went missing. He didn't make it back, but you did. Helping you get justice. It feels like honoring his memory. James nodded, understanding the weight behind her words. Your brother? Was he with the 10th Mountain Division? How did you know? They found me. A patrol from the 10th. Got me to the extraction point. I never knew their names, but... Rebecca's eyes widened. When? What date? March 15th. Just before sunrise. Rebecca sank into her chair, her professional demeanor cracking. Michael's last mission. His unit reported finding a surviving Marine, but the records were classified. That was you? Your brother's unit saved my life, James said softly. Gave me a chance to come home and expose these lies. I owe him a debt I can never repay. Then repay it by getting justice. Rebecca straightened, her resolve strengthened. Not just for yourself, but for every soldier who trusts their family to be faithful, their friends to be loyal. James gathered the evidence files, his mind already formulating plans. I will. But first, I need to secure Tommy's future. Everything else is secondary. One step at a time, Rebecca agreed. I'll file the emergency motions today. You focus on settling in at the shelter, establishing a routine. We'll need to show the court you can provide stability. They won't see me coming, James said, pausing at the door. They think they killed the old James Morrison, the trusting friend, the loving husband. Maybe they did. But they're about to meet the man who crawled out of those mountains. Rebecca watched him leave, then turned to her computer. She had motions to file, evidence to document, and a conspiracy to unravel. James Morrison had survived the mountains of Afghanistan only to find a different kind of war waiting at home. She would make sure he had the legal weapons to fight it. Chapter 3. A Father's Promise. The veteran shelter on Pine Street lived up to its reputation. James's small room was Spartan but private, and the other residents respected his space. Most importantly, it put him within walking distance of Tommy's school. Your son's a good kid, Frank Martinez said, sliding a coffee across the shelter's kitchen table. The former FBI agent now volunteered at the shelter, helping veterans navigate civilian life. Watched him at the playground yesterday. He's got your bearing. James nodded, hands wrapped around the warm cup. He's all I have left. Everything else they took, the house, the money, the life we built. I can let go. But not Tommy. You've got more than you think. Frank pulled out a notebook. Been making some calls. Steve Russell's position at Global Life Insurance? Created specifically for him, right after your deployment. Salaries way above industry standard for his experience level. Someone greased the wheels. Several someones, Frank confirmed. Your wife's friend Sarah wasn't the only one helping them. There's a whole network of people who facilitated this fraud. People who looked the other way, expedited paperwork, broke protocols. James leaned forward. How high does it go? High enough to make it interesting. Global Life Insurance has a special division handling military death benefits. Steve's cousin, The one who found your watch? He's connected to 3 other cases of expedited death benefits. All military, all paid out unusually fast. They've done this before. James's voice was deadly quiet. Different variations, same basic scheme. Find deployed soldiers in high-risk areas, track their movements, wait for an opportunity. Your case was just more personal. James stood, pacing the kitchen. Other veterans gave him space, recognizing the contained fury in his movements. They used my deployment, my service, as cover for their affair. Used my military benefits to fund their new life. Used my son's grief as camouflage for their fraud. And they're still spending, Frank added, sliding over some photographs. New car, country club membership, private school enrollment for Tommy. They're establishing themselves as pillars of the community. The grieving widow and the supportive friend who found love through tragedy. James examined the photos. Bethany and Steve at charity events, playing the perfect couple. Tommy between them, wearing private school uniforms that probably cost more than James's monthly salary. They're using my death benefits to buy legitimacy, he realized. Making connections, building a social network. Making it harder for anyone to question their story. Smart play, Frank admitted. In a few months, they'll just be another successful couple. Your death will be a sad footnote in their love story. Unless I expose them, James finished. But it has to be done right. Tommy can't be collateral damage. Frank nodded approvingly. Now you're thinking like an investigator, not just an angry husband. What's your first move? Secure Tommy, James said firmly. Rebecca's filing for emergency visitation. Once that's established, I start documenting everything. Build a case that's not just about me, but about systematic fraud targeting military families. Good. Think bigger than personal revenge. You're not just fighting for your son. You're fighting for every soldier who trusts their family while serving their country. James picked up one of the photos. Tommy at a school event. Steve's hand on his shoulder where James's should have been. They're using my son as a prop in their performance, making him complicit in their lies. Kids are resilient, Frank offered. With the right support, right guidance, Tommy can understand. No, James cut him off. Tommy never learns the full truth. Never knows how thoroughly his mother betrayed his father. That's my burden to carry. Frank studied him over the rim of his coffee cup. And what burden do they carry? Justice, James said simply. Not revenge, justice. For my brothers who died getting me home. For my son who was forced to grieve a father who wasn't dead. For every military family they've targeted with their fraud. You'll need help. Frank pulled out a business card. Got a friend at the local paper. Loves exposing insurance fraud, especially when it involves veterans. Could be useful down the line. James pocketed the card. Media attention brings scrutiny. Scrutiny brings questions. Questions make people nervous. And nervous people make mistakes. Frank smiled grimly. You're learning. A knock at the kitchen door interrupted them. Rebecca stood there, legal documents in hand. Emergency visitation granted, she announced. 3 supervised visits per week, starting tomorrow. Tommy's school has been notified. James felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. Thank you, both of you. I know taking on this case is the right thing to do, Rebecca finished. But James, there's something else. Something in Tommy's school records you need to see. She spread the documents on the table. Emergency contact forms, medical releases, school registration, all listing Steve as Tommy's father. Legal documents dated months before James was declared dead. They were erasing you before you even went missing, Rebecca said softly. Systematically replacing you in Tommy's official life. James stared at Steve's signature where his should have been, at the carefully crafted paper trail establishing Steve's paternal rights. Each document was another brick in the wall they'd built between him and his son. They thought of everything, he said quietly, except me coming back. That's their weakness, Frank pointed out. Their whole plan depends on you staying dead. Now that you're back, their foundation crumbles, Rebecca finished. Document they falsified, lie they told, dollar they spent. It all becomes evidence of conspiracy. James gathered Tommy's school papers carefully. They tried to erase me from my son's life. Used my military service as cover for their betrayal. Used my supposed death to steal my child. He looked at Rebecca and Frank, seeing allies where he'd expected to find only more betrayal. I made a promise to my brothers in Afghanistan. Said I'd get home to my family no matter what. Now I'm making a new promise to expose every lie, betrayal, person who helped them profit from my service. One step at a time, Rebecca cautioned. Tomorrow, focus on Tommy. Show the court you can be the father he needs. Everything else follows from that. James nodded, his mind already planning tomorrow's visitation. He'd focus on Tommy, yes, but he'd also start laying the groundwork for what was to come. Bethany and Steve had played a long game, thinking they had forever to perfect their lies. They were about to learn that forever wasn't as long as they thought. In his room that night, James spread Tommy's drawings across his bed. The progression from Daddy at War to Daddy in Heaven to our new family told the story of his erasure. But there was one drawing he kept separate, the newest one, made just after his return. It showed 3 figures, Daddy in his uniform, Tommy holding his hand, and an angel watching over them. No Bethany, no Steve, just a father and son under heaven's protection. James pinned this drawing above his bed. Tomorrow he'd start rebuilding his relationship with Tommy. And while he did, Bethany and Steve would learn that some soldiers refused to stay buried, some ghosts refused to rest, and some betrayals carried a cost no death benefit could cover. They had tried to write him out of his own life. Now he would show them the true meaning of resurrection. Chapter 4. Building the Trap. James Morrison sat in Frank Martinez's office at the local community college, reviewing surveillance photos spread across the weathered desk. 6 months had passed since his return, and each day had been dedicated to documenting, planning, and building his case against Bethany and Steve. Your wife and Steve just closed on a vacation property in the Outer Banks, Frank said, sliding over a property deed. $2.1 million. Way above their reported income, even with your death benefits. They're getting cocky, James replied, his voice carrying the cold precision of a sniper calculating distance. Making bigger moves, taking bigger risks. That's not all. Frank pulled up his laptop. Steve's been promoted twice at Global Life Insurance. He's now handling all military death benefit claims for the East Coast region. James leaned forward, his massive frame making the office chair creak. How many claims has he processed? 12 in the past 6 months. All fast-tracked, all paid out within weeks of notification. 3 of them involved his cousin's private security firm, finding evidence of death. They're expanding their operation, James concluded, using my case as a template. Military spouses desperate for closure, willing to accept any evidence that their loved ones are gone. Frank nodded grimly. Your case gave them confidence. They proved they could fake a death, collect the benefits, and build a new life without consequences. Now they're helping others do the same. For a fee, I assume? 20% of each payout, according to their offshore accounts. Frank pushed over more documents. They're building an empire on dead soldiers' money. James stood, moving to the window overlooking the college campus. Students hurried between classes, their lives untouched by the corruption he was uncovering. They're not just stealing money anymore. They're stealing closure from military families, making it impossible for real MIAs to come home. Because if too many soldiers return from the dead, their whole scheme collapses, James finished. Each successful fraud makes the next one easier to sell. Each dead soldier who stays dead validates their operation. A knock at the door interrupted them. Rebecca entered, carrying a thick legal folder. Court update on Tommy's visitation schedule. You've been granted additional time. 4 days a week now, including overnight stays on weekends. James turned from the window. How did Bethany take it? She tried playing the grieving widow who remarried for her son's stability. The judge wasn't impressed, especially after seeing the timeline of her relationship with Steve. And Tommy? Rebecca's face softened slightly. He's thriving in your visits. His teachers report he's more engaged, more confident. The court-appointed psychologist recommended expanding your custody rights. Speaking of Tommy, Frank interjected, he has a t-ball game this afternoon. Steve usually coaches, right? James checked his watch. He does. Makes a big show of being the perfect father figure. Might be worth attending, Frank suggested. Keep up appearances while we build our case. Show the court you're making an effort. James nodded, though his jaw tightened at the thought of watching Steve play father to his son. The past 6 months had been an exercise in controlled fury, each interaction with Bethany and Steve carefully measured to project defeat and resignation. They think I'm broken, James said, gathering the documents. A shell-shocked veteran who can barely function. Too damaged by war to fight for his rights. Rebecca smiled grimly. That's because they don't know what you did in those mountains. How long you survived. How far you went to make it home. No, James agreed, they don't. They see what I want them to see. A man going through the motions, following court orders, accepting his new reality. Frank locked the evidence in his desk. Keep playing that role. Let them think they've won. The more confident they get, the more mistakes they'll make, James finished. I learned in Afghanistan. The enemy is most vulnerable when they think they've already won. At the t-ball field that afternoon, James stood at the back of the bleachers, watching Steve coach Tommy's team. His son wore number 7, just like James had in Little League. Steve had dressed him in expensive gear, top-of-the-line equipment that probably came from James's death benefits. He's good with the kids, a mother next to James commented, not recognizing him. Such a blessing after what happened to Tommy's real father. Did you hear about that? Killed in action overseas. So tragic. James's hands gripped the metal railing. I heard. Must have been hard on the family. Oh, it was. But Steve stepped up, you know? Started dating the widow. Helped raise Tommy. They got married just last month. Private ceremony in the Bahamas. Romantic. Really. Finding love through tragedy. The Bahamas? James kept his voice neutral. Must have been expensive. They can afford it. I hear Steve's doing very well at his company. Something in insurance. The woman leaned closer, lowering her voice. Though between us, some people think they moved on awfully fast. The body wasn't even cold, so to speak. James watched as Steve demonstrated proper batting stance to Tommy, his hands positioning the boy's arms just as James had once imagined doing. Sometimes people surprise you with how quickly they can replace the dead. Tommy. Great hit, champ. Steve's voice carried across the field as James's son made contact with the ball. That's my boy. The words hit James like physical blows, but he maintained his facade of casual interest. 6 months of practice had taught him to channel his rage into patience, his betrayal into planning. After the game, Tommy spotted him and ran over, still in his uniform. Daddy, did you see my hit? I did, buddy. You're getting really good. James knelt to his son's level, conscious of Steve watching from the dugout. Uncle Steve, Daddy Steve, says I might make All-Stars next season. Tommy's innocent use of both titles twisted in James's gut. That would be amazing, champ. James forced a smile. Ready for our weekend together? I thought we could build that new Lego set you wanted. Tommy's face lit up, but Steve approached before he could respond. Great game, sport. Why don't you go get your gear while I talk to your father? James stood as Tommy ran off, using his full height advantage over Steve. 6 months ago, he would have struck his former friend down where he stood. Now he knew better. Patience was a weapon too. Didn't expect to see you here, Steve said, maintaining his coaching smile for any watching parents. Thought these games might be too stimulating for your condition. My condition? PTSD, survivor's guilt, adjustment issues, take your pick. That's what the court reports say, right? Poor damaged soldier struggling to reintegrate. James met Steve's gaze with the same look he'd given enemy combatants. You seem awfully confident for a man spending stolen money. Stolen? Everything we have is legal, documented, and approved by the proper authorities. Maybe if you'd actually died like you were supposed to, like the other soldiers whose death benefits you're processing? James watched satisfaction flicker across Steve's face. Yeah, I know about those. Know about your cousin's company too. Must be convenient, having someone on the ground to find evidence. Steve's smile faltered slightly. Careful, James. False accusations can complicate custody arrangements. Wouldn't want Tommy to suffer because his father's war trauma is making him paranoid. You're right, James agreed mildly. Trauma can do strange things to a man. Make him obsessive, detail-oriented. Make him document everything, just to be sure he's not imagining things. Before Steve could respond, Tommy returned with his gear. Ready, Daddy. Have him back by 6 on Sunday, Steve said, his coach's smile back in place. And James? Try to keep the war stories to a minimum. They give him nightmares. James watched Steve walk away, remembering how they'd once been brothers in all but blood. Now each interaction was combat, probing for weaknesses, testing defenses, laying groundwork for the final assault. Can we get ice cream? Tommy asked, pulling James from his thoughts. Of course, buddy. But first, I want to hear all about your game. Tell me about that hit. As they walked to the car, James listened to his son's excited chatter while his mind processed the new intelligence. Steve's arrogance confirmed Frank's assessment. They were expanding their operation, using James's death as proof their scheme worked. They thought they'd broken him, reduced him to supervised visits and careful interactions. They didn't realize each visitation was reconnaissance, each interaction intelligence gathering. In Afghanistan, James had learned that survival sometimes meant playing dead until the perfect moment to strike. Tommy's weekend visitations became James's anchor, the foundation around which he built his plans. They spent hours building Lego sets, each brick a moment reclaimed from Steve's attempts to replace him. James taught Tommy to fish, to throw a proper spiral, to solve math problems, marking his territory as a father while gathering evidence of Bethany and Steve's expanding fraud. In his small apartment, funded by his military pension, James maintained his facade of struggling veteran. But behind that mask, he was building a case that would destroy not just Bethany and Steve, but their entire network of fraud and betrayal. They had tried to bury him, not realizing he would grow stronger in the dark. Chapter 5. The Hidden Hand. The promotion letter arrived on Steve's desk on a Tuesday morning, printed on Global Life Insurance letterhead. Regional Director of Military Benefits, a position created specifically for him, with a salary that made his eyes widen. Congratulations are in order, his supervisor beamed. Your innovative approaches to military death claims have caught the attention of the board. They're particularly impressed with how quickly you process these sensitive cases. Steve leaned back in his leather chair, satisfaction warming his chest. The corner office, the luxury car, the vacation home, all pieces of the perfect life he'd built on James's supposed death. Now this promotion would let him expand their operation beyond the East Coast. What Steve didn't know was that James watched through the office's glass walls, dressed in maintenance coveralls as he emptied trash bins. The promotion letter had come from a printing company owned by one of Frank's FBI contacts. The board's attention had been directed by carefully placed recommendations from James's growing network of veterans and military families. Everything's in place, James reported later that evening, meeting Rebecca in a quiet diner far from their usual haunts. Steve took the bait. The promotion gives him access to all military death benefit claims nationwide. Rebecca sipped her coffee, reviewing the documents James had gathered. He's getting sloppy. These latest claims. The patterns are obvious if you know what to look for. Same evidence collection company, same expedited processing, same offshore account structures. Pride makes men careless, James quoted, remembering his grandfather's words. Each successful fraud makes them bolder. Speaking of bold, Rebecca pushed over a country club application. This came across my desk. Apparently, Steve and Bethany have been recommended for membership by several prominent members. James allowed himself a small smile. Frank's connections coming through. Nothing makes people talk like shared tea times and cocktail parties. You're playing a dangerous game, James. If they realize you're orchestrating their success, they won't. James cut her off. Their egos won't let them see it. Each victory confirms their belief that they're untouchable. Rebecca studied him across the table. 6 months of pursuing justice had hardened James, transformed his raw fury into cold calculation. And Tommy? How's he handling all this? He needs stability, James replied, his voice softening slightly. That's why everything has to be perfect. When we move against them, the evidence needs to be overwhelming. No room for sympathy, no chance of recovery. The country club membership includes access to their charity foundation, Rebecca noted. They'll be expected to contribute, make appearances, network with influential members. Let them, James said. Let them build their social circle, establish themselves as pillars of the community. The higher they climb, the harder they fall, Rebecca finished. But James, be careful. This kind of long game, it can change a person. James met her concerned gaze. I changed the moment I came home to find my wife spending my death benefits with my best friend. Everything since then has been about making sure they face justice. Meanwhile, across town, Bethany and Steve celebrated their latest success over champagne in their newly renovated kitchen. The country club membership lay on their granite countertop, another trophy in their carefully curated life. To us, Steve raised his glass. From grieving widow and supportive friend to power couple of the year, Bethany clinked her glass against his, admiring how the diamond on her finger, bought with James's death benefits, caught the light. James would never have given me this life. He was too simple, too focused on duty and honor. Honor doesn't buy vacation homes, Steve smirked, or country club memberships. Speaking of which, did you see the member list? Some serious influence in those names. And now we'll be part of their circle, Bethany smiled. No more military housing, no more living on a sergeant's salary. We've moved up in the world. Neither of them noticed the small device under their kitchen cabinet, planted during a routine pest inspection. James listened to their conversation through his earpiece, each word fueling his resolve. The device is working perfectly, Marcus Hayes confirmed over the secure line. The computer security expert had helped James legally document Bethany and Steve's conversations, building a record of their betrayal. They really think they've gotten away with it. They think James Morrison died in those mountains, James replied. They're about to meet the man who crawled back. The next morning, Steve arrived at his new corner office to find an anonymous note on his desk. Congratulations on the promotion. Some soldiers don't stay dead. He crumpled the note, dismissing it as a prank. Unaware that his reaction had been captured by security cameras, James now had access to through his maintenance worker cover. Each move they made, thinking they were climbing higher, only tightened the noose James was carefully laying. Their success was his creation, their confidence his weapon, their arrogance his opportunity. They had tried to erase James Morrison the soldier. Now they would face James Morrison the hunter. Chapter 6. Pieces in Motion. Summer faded into fall, painting Virginia in burnt oranges and deep reds. James's network grew like spreading roots, each connection carefully cultivated through Frank's contacts and Rebecca's legal channels. Marcus Hayes sat in his cybersecurity office, multiple monitors displaying Bethany and Steve's digital footprint. They're not even trying to hide anymore, he reported to James via secured line. Social media posts about charity events, photos of Tommy at private school functions, vacation pictures from the Outer Banks property. They're building their legacy, James replied, watching a live feed of Steve's office. Creating a narrative of the grieving family who found happiness through tragedy. While processing more fraudulent death benefits, Marcus added, 5 new cases this month alone, all fast-tracked, all involving Steve's cousin's security firm finding conclusive evidence in active combat zones. How many families? 17 total since your case. Over 6 million in fraudulent claims. Marcus's voice hardened. They're using your story to convince other spouses to accept death certificates without bodies. Your death is their proof the system works. James absorbed this information with cold fury. Each fraudulent claim represented a family denied closure, a soldier erased for profit. Keep tracking the money. I want to know where each dollar lands. Already on it. They're getting bold with the transfers too. Offshore accounts, shell companies, all registered through Steve's new corporate connections. A notification pinged on Marcus's screen. Heads up, Tommy's asking questions at school. His teacher reported he's been drawing pictures of you in uniform, but not as an angel anymore. James leaned forward. What kind of pictures? You in your dress blues, standing at attention. Steve's in the background, behind bars. Marcus sent the image file. Kids are more perceptive than we give them credit for. He knows something's coming, James mused. Children sense changes before adults do. Speaking of changes, Marcus typed rapidly, bringing up new documents. Bethany's been meeting with a divorce lawyer. High-powered firm, specializes in military pensions and benefits. This was new information. James's mind calculated possibilities, angles, threats. She's preparing an escape route. Smart move on her part. If Steve's operation gets exposed, she claims ignorance, files for divorce, keeps her share of the money. James completed the thought. She didn't just betray me as a wife. She betrayed Tommy as a mother. There's something else. Marcus hesitated. She's been looking into private schools. International ones. James's voice turned arctic. She's planning to run with Tommy. Costa Rica. They have a lax extradition policy and several elite private schools that cater to wealthy expatriates. Marcus brought up travel websites from Bethany's search history. She's been researching property there too. Like hell, James snarled. Get me everything. School applications, property inquiries, all of it. And Marcus? Thank you. For everything. They took advantage of my own divorce, Marcus replied simply. Used it to hide assets, manipulate the system. This is personal for all of us. Later that evening, James met with Rebecca in her office, sharing Marcus's findings. The JAG officer studied the documents with growing concern. She's laying groundwork, Rebecca concluded. If Steve's operation gets exposed, she presents herself as another victim. Files for divorce, claims she was manipulated. Takes Tommy somewhere safe to recover from the trauma. Using my son as a shield. James's voice carried deadly intent. Again. We need to accelerate our timeline, Rebecca advised. Before she can move Tommy out of jurisdiction. No, James stood, pacing the office. We stick to the plan. Push them toward bigger risks, more public exposure. Let them dig their graves deeper. While watching Tommy like a hawk, Rebecca added, I'll have the court add travel restrictions to your custody agreement. No international trips without both parents' consent. James nodded, then paused at a noise outside. Tommy stood in the hallway, clutching his backpack. The boys' weekend visitation had started early. The school called, Tommy explained. Mommy and Daddy Steve had a charity event. James and Rebecca exchanged glances. Another piece of evidence, child neglect, documented by school officials. Come here, buddy. James opened his arms. Tommy ran into them, burying his face in his father's chest. How about we grab dinner and you can tell me about your day? As they left Rebecca's office, James's mind worked multiple angles. Bethany's escape plans, Steve's expanding fraud operation, Tommy's growing awareness. All pieces moving on the board. At a quiet diner, over burgers and fries, Tommy looked up from his meal. Daddy? Are you going to make Daddy Steve go away? James studied his son carefully. What makes you ask that, champ? I heard Mommy talking on the phone. She said you're watching them, that you're going to ruin everything. Tommy pushed his fries around. She wants us to go on a big trip, but she said we can't tell you. How do you feel about that, buddy? Tommy's lower lip trembled. I don't want to go away. I want to stay with you. Daddy Steve isn't. He's not. Not what, Tommy? Not real, Tommy whispered. He pretends, but he's not like you. He doesn't know the special handshake, or how to make monster voices for bedtime stories, or anything real. James reached across the table, gripping his son's small hand. I promise you, Tommy, no one's taking you anywhere. You're staying right here with me. Even if Mommy cries, she cries a lot now. When she thinks I'm sleeping, even then, James confirmed. Sometimes grown-ups make bad choices, and then they have to deal with what happens after. But none of that is your fault, okay? Tommy nodded, then brightened. Can we work on my science project this weekend? It's about soldiers' honor code. James smiled, genuine warmth breaking through his tactical mindset. Of course we can. Tell me more about it. While Tommy chattered about his project, James's phone buzzed. A text from Frank. Steve took the bait. He's applying for access to West Coast military death benefits. Board meeting next week. Another piece sliding into place. Steve's greed would be his undoing, his ambition the rope for his hanging. But first, James had a science project to help with, a son to protect, and a network to coordinate. The next week passed in careful movements. James maintained his facade of struggling veteran during custody exchanges, letting Bethany and Steve see what they expected. a broken man focused only on his visitation rights. Meanwhile, his network expanded. Marcus monitored their digital footprint, documenting every transaction, communication. Frank's FBI contacts built their case, connecting dots between fraudulent claims. Rebecca prepared legal documents, ready to strike from multiple angles. They're planning something big, Frank reported during their weekly meeting. Steve's been meeting with private banking officials, setting up new offshore accounts. Let me guess, James studied the surveillance photos. Preparing for the West Coast expansion, going after California military bases, Frank confirmed. Lots of deployed personnel, lots of potential targets. How many families have they destroyed already? Rebecca asked softly. How many soldiers' memories have they corrupted for profit? Too many, James replied. But it ends with them. No more false death certificates, no more stolen benefits, no more erasing soldiers for profit. The pieces were in motion now, each player moving according to James's careful choreography. Bethany and Steve thought they were expanding their empire, unaware that each step forward brought them closer to destruction. They had tried to write James out of his own life. Now he would write the ending to their story, and it would be one the military community would never forget. In his small apartment that night, James reviewed Tommy's completed science project, a presentation on military honor, loyalty, and sacrifice. His son had interviewed him about his service, about what those values meant in real life. A soldier's honor isn't just about fighting, James had explained. It's about standing up for what's right, protecting those who can't protect themselves, and never, ever betraying your brothers in arms. Tommy had nodded solemnly, writing in his careful child's handwriting. Honor means keeping your promises, even when it's hard. How right his son was. James had promised his brothers in Afghanistan he'd make it home. He'd kept that promise. Now he had new promises to keep, to Tommy, to the families Steve and Bethany had defrauded, to the memory of every soldier they'd erased for profit. The long game was approaching its endgame. Each piece was positioned, each trap set, each escape route blocked. Bethany's plans for escape, Steve's dreams of expansion, their carefully constructed facade of legitimacy, all would crumble when the time was right. They thought they'd buried a soldier and inherited his life. Instead, they'd awakened a force of reckoning, and its patience was running out. Fall was giving way to winter, and with it, the final phase of James's plan would begin. But that was a story for another act. For now, he had his son's project to finish, his network to maintain, and his enemies to watch as they climbed higher, unaware of how far they would fall. Chapter 7. The Gathering Storm. The annual Veterans Day celebration transformed the country club into a showcase of wealth and pretense. Crystal chandeliers reflected off polished surfaces while string quartet music drifted through the air. James observed it all from his position near the kitchen entrance, dressed in catering staff attire. Target acquired. Marcus's voice came through his earpiece. Steve and Bethany just arrived. They're working the room clockwise, starting with the major donors. Status on FBI teams? James asked quietly, adjusting a tray of champagne flutes. In position. Agent Thompson has 4 teams on standby. Mrs. Henderson and the neighbors are seated at table 6, all evidence documented and ready. JAG officers are spread throughout the crowd. James watched Steve guide Bethany through the gathering, his hand possessive on her waist. They dressed for their roles, him in a tailored tuxedo that probably cost more than a month of military pay, her in a designer gown bought with death benefits meant to support a soldier's family. My brave Steve, Bethany's voice carried as they passed James. The way you've helped so many military families find closure. You're an angel, just doing what James would have wanted, Steve replied, his practiced humility making James's jaw clench. Supporting our veterans, helping their families move forward. Frank's voice crackled in the earpiece. That's 17 people so far who've mentioned their charitable work. All on record. James moved through the crowd, invisible in his server's uniform. He caught fragments of conversations, each one feeding his cold rage. Such a touching story, a society matron gushed. Finding love after such tragedy. And so generous with the veterans' causes, her companion added. They say Steve's processed over $20 million in death benefits this year alone. Bethany's been a rock for other military widows, another guest commented, showing them how to move forward, find happiness again. Time check. Rebecca's voice joined the communications. Auction starts in 30 minutes. All evidence packets are in place at the FBI command post. James positioned himself near the stage where Steve and Bethany would soon make their grand gesture, bidding on a luxury vacation package, making a show of their success while other military families struggled with loss. Tommy's latest drawing burned in James's pocket. The boy had given it to him that morning, a picture of his father in dress blues, standing tall while stick figures and handcuffs represented the bad people who lied. "You're going to make them pay, right, Daddy?" Tommy had asked. "For all the lies?" "Yes, son," James had promised. Tonight, everyone learns the truth. Now he watched Steve take the microphone, ready to address the gathered elite. Bethany stood beside him, playing her role as the supportive wife who'd found love through tragedy. "Distinguished guests," Steve began, his insurance executive charm in full force. "We gather tonight not just to raise funds, but to honor those who've made the ultimate sacrifice. As someone who's worked closely with military families, who's helped them find closure and move forward," James noted the FBI agents moving into position, their formal attire blending perfectly with the crowd. Mrs. Henderson sat with other neighbors who documented Bethany and Steve's betrayal, their evidence ready to support federal charges. "When I lost my best friend James Morrison in Afghanistan," Steve continued, his voice thick with fabricated emotion, "I promised to look after his family, to help his widow and son build a new life." "Package incoming," Marcus reported. Global life insurance internal documents, proving Steve created fake death certificates for multiple soldiers. "Uploading to FBI servers now." James touched his earpiece. "Surveillance footage?" "All archived," Frank confirmed. Steve's meetings with his cousin about planting evidence, Bethany's calls about expediting death certificates, their conversations about expanding the operation to the West Coast. Rebecca's voice joined in. "JAG officers are in position. Military fraud documentation is ironclad." James watched Steve raise his auction paddle, bidding on the vacation package. The perfect moment approached, the fraudulent couple at the height of their performance, surrounded by the society they'd manipulated. "For our final item," the auctioneer announced, "a luxury getaway to the French Riviera, including private jet service and accommodations at—" Steve's paddle rose again and again, making a show of his wealth. Bethany clutched his arm, playing the adoring wife, both of them basking in their apparent triumph. "Sold," the auctioneer declared. "To Mr. and Mrs. Russell for $120,000. Applause filled the room. Steve raised his champagne glass in victory, Bethany beaming beside him. The moment had come. James nodded to Frank, who signaled the FBI teams. As Steve prepared to make his acceptance speech, federal agents emerged from the crowd. "Stephen Russell," Agent Thompson's voice cut through the applause. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, falsification of military death certificates, and misappropriation of military death benefits." The champagne glass slipped from Steve's hand, shattering on the stage. Bethany's perfectly made-up face froze in shock as another agent approached her with handcuffs. "What is this?" Steve demanded, his executive confidence cracking. "There must be some mistake." "No mistake," James said, stepping forward and removing his server's jacket to reveal his Marine dress uniform underneath. Medals from his combat service gleamed under the chandelier lights as he took the microphone. "The only mistake was thinking you could steal a soldier's life and never face consequences." The room fell silent as James addressed the stunned crowd, his voice carrying the weight of mountains and battles and betrayal. "Some of you attended my funeral," he began, his cold gaze sweeping the gathering. "You mourned with my son, who was told his father died a hero. Instead, his father was fighting to get home while his mother and my best friend cashed in on my supposed death." Bethany tried to step forward. "James, please, I can explain." "Explain what?" His voice cut like a combat knife. "How you declared me dead while I was still fighting to survive. How you spent my death benefits on vacations while my son drew pictures of his father in heaven. Or how you and Steve turned my death into an industry, helping other wives collect benefits for soldiers who might still be alive." The assembled guests drew back from Bethany and Steve as if their betrayal was contagious. Society matrons who'd praised their charity work now whispered behind manicured hands. Business leaders who'd welcomed Steve into their clubs suddenly found the floor fascinating. Mrs. Henderson stood, her aged voice carrying moral authority. We saw it all. The affair before deployment, the rushed death certificate, the spending sprees. We documented everything. 23 families, Frank added, stepping forward to display documents. 23 soldiers declared dead through Mr. Russell's insurance division, all processed with falsified evidence from his cousin's security firm. Rebecca joined them, legal files in hand. The evidence trail is comprehensive. Bank records, surveillance footage, witness statements, documenting systematic fraud targeting military families. Steve's arrogance finally shattered. You orchestrated this? The promotion, the country club membership? I learned in the mountains, James replied, his voice arctic. Sometimes you have to play dead to survive. You taught my son I was dead, spent my death benefits, erased me from his life. Now you learn what it means when the dead come back. As FBI agents led them away, Bethany's mascara traced black tears down her face. Their social circle parted like water, no one willing to meet their eyes or acknowledge their pleas. James, Steve tried one last time. Brother, please. My brothers died in Afghanistan. James cut him off. Martinez and Rodriguez gave their lives helping me get home. You died the moment you betrayed me. The Steve Russell I knew wouldn't steal from dead soldiers. The gathered crowd watched in stunned silence as handcuffs clicked into place. The perfect couple, the charitable pillars of society, revealed as frauds who profited from soldiers' sacrifices. Mrs. Henderson approached James, patting his arm. Your father would be proud, son. He didn't raise a man who'd let betrayal go unpunished. James nodded, thinking of Tommy's drawing. His son would learn that justice might take time, but it always arrived. That a Marine's honor wasn't just about fighting battles, but about standing up for truth no matter the cost. The reckoning had begun, but it was far from over. Chapter 8. The Fall. The country club ballroom transformed into a crime scene. FBI agents collected evidence while shell-shocked guests provided statements. James stood with Rebecca and Frank, watching their months of planning unfold. Full confession from Steve's assistant, Frank reported, checking his phone. She's detailing how they identified potential targets. Soldiers in high-risk areas, minimal family connections, deployed to regions where verification would be difficult. And Bethany's friend in military administration? Rebecca asked. Singing like a bird, Frank confirmed. Apparently, she wasn't the only one they had on payroll. Steve built a whole network of corrupt officials to expedite death certificates. James watched Bethany through the glass doors of a side room, where FBI agents took her statement. Her designer dress and perfect makeup couldn't hide her desperation now. You have visitors, Marcus said through the earpiece. Tommy's teacher is here with him. She got worried when Bethany didn't pick him up from the after-school program. James turned as his son ran into the ballroom, still in his school clothes. Tommy stopped short, taking in the FBI jackets, the handcuffs, his mother's tears. Daddy? Tommy's voice wavered. Did you catch the bad people? James knelt to his son's level. Yes, buddy. Remember how we talked about telling the truth, about keeping promises? Tommy nodded solemnly. You promised you'd make things right. That's what we did tonight. Sometimes adults make bad choices, and then they have to face consequences. Like when Mommy and Daddy Steve spent your heaven money? James hugged his son close, shielding him from the sight of his mother being processed by federal agents. Exactly. But you don't have to worry about any of that anymore. You're staying with me now. Forever? Tommy's eyes lit up. No more switching houses? Forever, James confirmed. We'll get your own room set up, exactly how you want it. Rebecca approached carefully. James, we need your statement for the record. And she hesitated. Bethany's asking to speak with you. James stood, keeping his hand on Tommy's shoulder. Take my son to the security office? I don't want him to see this part. After Tommy left with Rebecca, James entered the side room where Bethany waited. Her mascara-stained face tried to summon tears that wouldn't come. How long? She demanded. How long have you been planning this? Since the day I came home to find you declared me dead for profit. James's voice held no emotion. Everything since then, Steve's promotion, the country club membership, the social connections, all designed to make you feel safe while we built the case. It wasn't supposed to be like this, Bethany protested. When they told us about the explosion, you didn't wait for confirmation, James cut her off. You didn't wait because you and Steve already had plans. The affair started before my deployment, didn't it? Her silence was answer enough. We found the travel receipts, James continued. Hotel meetings while I was in pre-deployment training. Restaurant charges when you were supposed to be at grief counseling. You weren't just opportunistic. You planned my death before I even left. I never meant to get caught, James finished. You meant for me to stay dead in those mountains. Meant for Steve to replace me in Tommy's life. Meant to spend my death benefits on your new beginning. Bethany's facade cracked completely. What's going to happen now? Now? You face federal charges for conspiracy and fraud. The death benefits get repaid from your seized assets. Tommy stays with me, where he'll learn about honor and truth instead of lies and betrayal. You can't take my son. James leaned forward, his combat-hardened voice dropping to a whisper. I'm not taking him. You lost him the moment you taught him his father was dead. The moment you let another man claim him while spending money meant to support my child. I'll fight you, Bethany threatened weakly. I have rights. Rights? James laughed without humor. You declared me dead while I was missing in action. Used faked evidence to collect benefits. Let our son believe I was gone forever. Your rights ended the moment you betrayed your family for money. He stood, straightening his uniform. Enjoy the prison visits with Steve. I'm sure you can swap stories about all the military families you defrauded together. As he left, Bethany called out one last time. I did love you once. James didn't turn back. No. You loved what I represented. Stable military income, death benefits, a convenient absence while you built your escape plan. But you never loved me. If you had, you wouldn't have erased me from my son's life. The door closed on Bethany's sobs. Outside, FBI agents continued gathering evidence, documenting the extent of the fraud. Steve sat in handcuffs, his executive confidence replaced by the hollow look of a man watching his empire crumble. Final count, Frank reported, joining James. Over $30 million in fraudulent death benefits. 23 families affected. Steve's cousin is being picked up in Afghanistan right now. Turns out he was planting false evidence in active combat zones. The other families? James asked. Being notified. Some of their soldiers might still be alive, listed as MIA. We're reopening those cases, challenging the death certificates. Rebecca appeared with Tommy, who clutched a new drawing. Look, Daddy. I drew us in our new house. James studied the crayon artwork, two stick figures, father and son, standing together under a bright sun. No angels, no heaven, no replacement father figure. Just truth, finally restored. It's perfect, buddy, James said, tucking the drawing into his uniform pocket. Let's go home. As they left the country club, James heard Steve being read his rights, heard Bethany's pleas for leniency. But those sounds meant nothing now. He had his son, had his justice, had his truth restored. They had tried to bury him in those mountains. Instead, he'd returned to bury their lies. Chapter 9. Justice Served. The federal courthouse buzzed with tension as the judge prepared to deliver sentencing. 6 months of trials had exposed the full scope of Steve and Bethany's operation, a network of fraud that had preyed on military families across the country. James sat in the front row, dress uniform pressed to perfection, Tommy beside him in a miniature suit. Rebecca occupied the seat on Tommy's other side, legal papers organized in her lap. All rise. The bailiff called as Judge Marshall entered. Steve and Bethany stood with their attorneys, both wearing prison orange instead of designer clothes. Their appeals had failed, their attempts to shift blame rejected by mountains of evidence. Before delivering my sentence, Judge Marshall began, I want to address the scope of these crimes. This wasn't simply insurance fraud. This wasn't merely theft. This was a systematic betrayal of everything we owe our military families. The judge fixed Steve with a stern gaze. Mr. Russell, you abused your position at Global Life Insurance to create a network of fraud targeting our most vulnerable military families. You exploited grieving spouses, manipulated the system meant to support them, and profited from uncertainty about our missing soldiers. Steve stared at the floor, unable to meet the judge's eyes. And you, Mrs. Russell, formerly Mrs. Morrison, the judge continued, you didn't just participate in this fraud. You provided the template, showing other spouses how to declare their missing husbands dead for profit. You spent death benefits meant for your son on luxuries while he drew pictures of his father in heaven. Bethany tried to turn toward Tommy, but James shifted, blocking her view of their son. The evidence is overwhelming, Judge Marshall declared. Bank records, surveillance footage, witness testimony, all painting a picture of calculated, continuing fraud. This court sentences Stephen Russell to 25 years in federal prison for conspiracy, fraud, and criminal exploitation of military benefits. Steve's shoulders slumped as his attorney gripped his arm. Additionally, Bethany Russell is sentenced to 15 years for her role in the conspiracy. All assets purchased with fraudulent death benefits will be seized and returned to the affected families. The judge paused, removing her glasses. But perhaps the most severe punishment is this. You stole more than money. You stole faith from military families. You corrupted a system meant to honor sacrifice. You taught a child to believe his father was dead while spending the money meant to support him. No prison sentence can fully repay that debt. As the bailiffs led Steve and Bethany away, James felt Tommy grip his hand. They're going to jail? Tommy asked quietly. Yes, buddy. For a long time. Good. Tommy nodded with a child's simple sense of justice. They told lies about you being dead. Rebecca gathered her files, her voice professional despite the emotion in her eyes. The seized assets will help other military families. Some soldiers declared dead might still be out there, fighting to come home like you did. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered for statements. Frank stepped forward to handle the press, while James shielded Tommy from the cameras. This case represents the largest military benefits fraud ever prosecuted, Frank announced. Thanks to Sergeant Morrison's dedication, we've exposed a network that preyed on military families during their most vulnerable moments. James led Tommy to their car, leaving the media circus behind. His new home waited, a modest house bought with his military pension, not stolen death benefits. Tommy's room was already decorated with Marine Corps memorabilia and his drawings, each one showing father and son together. Can we get pizza? Tommy asked as they drove home. To celebrate the bad people going to jail? James smiled. Sure, champ. But first, there's something I want to show you. They stopped at a small military cemetery. James led Tommy to two graves, Martinez and Rodriguez, the brothers who died helping him get home. These men believed in honor, James explained, straightening small American flags by each headstone. They gave their lives so I could return to you. That's why we had to stop people like Mommy and Steve, because they disrespected sacrifices like this. Tommy placed a hand on Rodriguez's headstone. They were heroes? Yes. Real heroes who understood loyalty and truth. Not people who pretend to honor soldiers while stealing from their families. At home later, over pizza, Tommy looked up from his drawing pad. Daddy, are you gonna marry Miss Rebecca? James nearly choked on his slice. What makes you ask that? She looks at you like those princesses look at princes in my books. And she helped catch the bad people. It's complicated, buddy. Grown-ups always say that. Tommy rolled his eyes with childhood wisdom. But she makes you smile. Real smiles. Not the pretend ones you used when you were tricking Mommy and Steve. Before James could respond, the doorbell rang. Rebecca stood outside, holding case files. Final paperwork on the asset seizure, she explained. And, she hesitated. I thought you both might want company for dinner. Tommy grinned triumphantly. We have pizza, and I'm drawing our new family. James met Rebecca's eyes over their son's head. She'd stood with him through the darkest moments, helped him reclaim his life and protect his son. Maybe Tommy's innocent observation wasn't so complicated after all. Would you like to stay? James asked. Rebecca's smile was answer enough. 1 year after his return from the mountains, James stood in his backyard, watching Tommy play with Rebecca's niece. The sound of children's laughter had replaced the echo of betrayal. Was it worth it? Rebecca asked softly, joining him. James thought about Bethany and Steve in prison, their empire of lies destroyed. He thought about the other military families receiving justice, about the seized assets helping soldiers' children. Most importantly, he thought about Tommy's renewed trust, about the nights they spent talking about honor and truth. Justice isn't about worth, he replied. It's about showing the world that some things are still sacred, that loyalty matters, that truth prevails. Tommy ran over, waving his latest drawing. No angels, no lies, no fake fathers, just a family built on honor and truth. James Morrison hadn't just survived, he had triumphed. His revenge wasn't just punishment, it was restoration. He had restored his son's faith, restored his own sense of justice, and perhaps most importantly, restored hope for others who had been betrayed. The community had learned a powerful lesson. Sometimes the dead do come back, and when they do, they bring with them a reckoning that no amount of stolen money can prevent. In the end, James kept the promise he'd made while fighting through those mountains. He made it home to his family. Not the family that betrayed him, but the one he built from the ashes of their lies. A son who knew the value of truth, a woman who understood sacrifice, and a legacy of justice that would protect other military families from similar betrayals. They had tried to bury him, to erase his existence for profit. Instead, he had risen to expose their corruption and restore honor to the system they'd exploited. In doing so, he proved that some soldiers refuse to die, some lies refuse to stand, and some betrayals carry a cost that no prison sentence can fully repay. Epilogue. 10 years later. The United States Military Academy at West Point buzzed with excitement as families gathered for Parents' Weekend. Among them, retired Marine Sergeant James Morrison stood tall in his dress blues, watching his 15-year-old son Tommy lead the freshman drill team demonstration. "He moves just like you," Rebecca Morrison said, squeezing her husband's hand. Their wedding bands caught the autumn sunlight. Same precision, same focus. James nodded, pride evident in his bearing as Tommy executed perfect commands. The young cadet had grown into a striking combination of his father's strength and his stepmother's intelligence. More importantly, he'd grown up understanding the true meaning of honor. Major Andrews, a passing officer, saluted Rebecca, who returned it with practiced ease. After the successful prosecution of the military benefits fraud case, she'd been promoted rapidly within the JAG Corps, eventually heading a new division dedicated to preventing exploitation of military families. "The Thompson case files are ready for review, ma'am," her aide reported, handing over a tablet. 3 more fraudulent death benefit claims identified through the Morrison Protocol. The Morrison Protocol, named after James's case, had become standard procedure for verifying military death benefits. Every claim now underwent rigorous verification, with special attention paid to missing and action cases. The system Steve and Bethany had exploited was now a fortress against similar fraud. "Dad." Tommy jogged over after the demonstration, his uniform immaculate. "Did you see the new maneuvers we added?" "Perfect execution, son." James clasped his boy's shoulder. "Your grandfather would have been proud." Tommy beamed at the mention of his grandfather, the Vietnam veteran. Though he'd never met him, the stories of 3 generations of Morrison military service had helped shape his character. "Mrs. Henderson sent another care package," Tommy reported. "She still makes the best cookies in Virginia." The elderly neighbor had become Tommy's honorary grandmother, her unwavering support during the dark days of betrayal earning her a permanent place in their family. Now in her 80s, she still sent monthly packages to her West Point cadet. Speaking of Virginia, Rebecca interjected, "Frank's task force made another arrest yesterday. Remember Steve's cousin, the one who planted false evidence in Afghanistan?" James's expression hardened slightly. "He got out last year, didn't he? Tried rebuilding the old network," Rebecca explained. "Frank caught him before he could file a single false claim." The Morrison Protocol flagged his first attempt. Frank Martinez had transformed his FBI experience and connections into a specialized task force, hunting down military benefits fraud across the country. His team had become legendary in law enforcement circles, with a 100% conviction rate. "Marcus called," Tommy added. "He's speaking at next week's cybersecurity seminar." asked if I want to learn some new encryption techniques. Marcus Hayes had parlayed his role in exposing the fraud into a successful cybersecurity consulting firm, specializing in protecting military family benefits. He'd become Tommy's unofficial tech mentor, teaching him to use technology ethically and defensively. "How's the history project coming along?" James asked as they walked toward the campus cafe. "The one about military honor codes?" "Actually," Tommy hesitated. "I wanted to talk to you about that. I'm writing about your case, how you exposed the fraud and changed the system. Professor Phillips says it could be published in the Academy Journal." James stopped walking. "You sure you want to dig into all that? People need to know, Dad. Not just about the fraud, but about how you fought back. How you protected other military families." Tommy's voice carried conviction beyond his years. "Besides, Bethany and Steve are still in prison. Their story needs to be a warning." The mention of his ex-wife and former best friend didn't sting anymore. Bethany had served 8 years before being released on parole, now working a minimum wage job in Nevada. Steve remained in federal prison, his appeals exhausted, his empire of fraud dismantled. "The warning's already working," Rebecca noted. "Military benefit fraud is down 90% since your case. The Morrison Protocol has saved hundreds of millions in false claims." They reached the cafe, finding their usual table. Tommy excused himself to join his classmates, his straight posture and confident stride reflecting his upbringing. "He's going to make an incredible officer," Rebecca said softly. James watched his son, remembering the confused 5-year-old who'd drawn pictures of his father in heaven. He learned the hard way that honor isn't just about following rules. It's about standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. Speaking of standing up, Rebecca checked her phone. Sarah Collins is being released next month. James raised an eyebrow. Bethany's friend who had helped expedite his death certificate had served 5 years for her role in the fraud. She's still cooperating? Teaches anti-fraud seminars to military administration staff. Her testimony has helped convict 12 other conspirators from the old network. Their conversation paused as a group of cadets stopped by their table, eagerly greeting Tommy's parents. James's case had become required study at the academy, an example of how honor and persistence could overcome betrayal and corruption. "Sergeant Morrison," one cadet asked, "is it true you maintained your cover for 6 months while building the case?" 7 months, James corrected. "The hardest part wasn't playing weak. It was watching them spend money meant for military families while pretending I didn't care." "But you cared enough to change the whole system," another cadet noted. "The Morrison Protocol protects all of us now." After the cadets left, Rebecca touched James's arm. "They're why it was worth it. Each cadet who learns from your case is another defender against corruption." James nodded, watching Tommy lead his study group. His son had chosen to follow family tradition into military service, but with a deeper understanding of what that service meant. He'd grown up watching his father fight not just for personal justice, but for systemic change. "Did you see Tommy's latest letter to Mrs. Henderson?" Rebecca asked. "He's teaching other cadets about maintaining connections with their communities, especially elderly neighbors who support military families." "She changed everything," James acknowledged. "Without her documentation of Bethany and Steve's betrayal, without her support when I came back, she's the reason Tommy understood what real loyalty looks like." Their phones buzzed simultaneously, a news alert. Another fraud ring had been busted, this one operating out of Texas. The Morrison Protocol had flagged suspicious death benefit claims, triggering an investigation that saved millions in military family support funds. "Your legacy," Rebecca squeezed his hand. "Not just Tommy, but all these systems protecting military families. The networks supporting returning soldiers. The protocols preventing fraud." James thought about the long road from those Afghan mountains to this moment. He'd returned to find his life stolen, his son taught to believe he was dead, his wife and best friend profiting from his supposed death. But from that betrayal had come something powerful, a transformation of the system itself. The afternoon sun slanted across the academy grounds as families began gathering for the evening parade. Tommy rejoined them, now accompanied by Rebecca's niece Maria, a sophomore cadet who'd been inspired by her aunt's legal career to study military justice. "Uncle James," Maria said, "my ethics professor wants to interview you for her book." It's about moral courage in military families. Another book? Tommy grinned. Dad's case is already in 3 textbooks and 2 documentaries. Because it changed everything, Maria insisted. Not just catching the bad guys, but fixing the system so it protects people better. James watched the interaction between his son and niece, seeing the next generation of military leaders developing their own understanding of honor and justice. They'd grown up knowing his story not as a tragedy of betrayal, but as a testament to resilience and systemic change. The FBI training program still uses your case study, Rebecca added. Frank says it's the perfect example of how patience and planning can bring down entire criminal networks. It wasn't about revenge, James said quietly. It was about making sure no other soldier came home to find their death benefits spent, their child taught to believe they were dead, their sacrifice exploited for profit. Tommy checked his watch. We should head to the parade grounds. My squad's leading the colors ceremony. As they walked across the academy grounds, James reflected on the decade since his return from Afghanistan. The betrayal that could have destroyed him had instead forged something stronger, a family built on real honor, a system reformed to protect the vulnerable, a son who understood the true meaning of service. The evening parade began, hundreds of cadets in perfect formation. Tommy stood at attention, his bearing reflecting both his father's strength and his own developing character. In the stands, James and Rebecca sat with other proud parents, their shared work protecting military families now extending into a new generation. Later that night, in their hotel room, Rebecca reviewed case files while James read Tommy's history project draft. He's included everything, James noted. The initial betrayal, the long game of gathering evidence, the final takedown at the country club. But he's focused on the reforms that followed, not just the revenge. Because that's your real legacy, Rebecca set aside her tablet. Not just exposing one fraud, but changing how we protect military families. The Morrison Protocol, the enhanced verification systems, the support networks, they'll outlast all of us. James thought about Bethany and Steve, still paying for their crimes. Their betrayal had been personal, but his response had transformed an entire system. Now, a decade later, military families were safer, benefits more secure, and his son was part of the next generation ensuring that protection continued. Tommy's final paragraph summed it up perfectly. My father's story isn't just about a soldier who came back from the dead to expose fraud. It's about how one man's fight for justice became a shield protecting thousands of military families. The betrayal he faced led to reforms that will guard soldiers' families for generations to come. That's the true meaning of honor. Not just standing up for yourself, but standing up for all those who serve. The next morning, watching Tommy march with his unit, James realized his son had captured the essence of their journey. The betrayal had been personal, but the justice had become universal. From the ashes of lies had risen not just a restored family, but a transformed system. They had tried to bury him, to erase his existence for profit. Instead, he had built a legacy of protection and reform that would outlive any attempt at betrayal. The dead had not only come back, they had changed the world they returned to, ensuring that such betrayals would never again go unchallenged or unpunished. The Morrison Protocol stood as his testament. Tommy carried his example, and military families across the nation slept safer knowing that the system now protected their sacrifices. In the end, that was worth more than any revenge. It was justice that would echo through generations. The cadets' marching footsteps echoed across the parade ground, a rhythm like heartbeats, like justice, like honor preserved and protected. James Morrison watched his son among them, knowing that his fight had ensured these young leaders would serve in a world better guarded against betrayal. They had tried to erase him from his son's life. Instead, he had written his principles into the very systems protecting military families, ensuring that honor and justice would stand guard long after his own battles were done.